That September morning in 1851, what happened in the cotton field was witnessed by 47 slaves. Yet in the official records of Warren County, Mississippi, not a single testimony was ever recorded. Beneath the merciless sun, what they saw would be whispered about for generations in slave quarters, passed down in hushed warnings and coded spirituals, always ending the same way. With an albino field hand who simply vanished and a white man's blood soaking into Mississippi soil. The death is shown as accidental exsanguination in the plantation ledgers. But a different story is told entirely by the county coroner's notes, sealed for 73 years. The impossible timeline of events, the contradictions in the evidence, and the strange marks found carved into the cotton gin that morning have been tried away by local historians. But on the Rutledge plantation, something far darker than simple murder happened. Something that made 47 people agree to carry a secret to their graves without a single word spoken. Before we continue with the story of Caleb and the blood-soaked cotton fields of the Rutledge plantation, I want to ask you something. To bring you the darkest, most unsettling stories from America's hidden past is why this channel exists. The ones that were deliberately buried. The ones that challenge everything we think we know about history. If stories like this fascinate you, if you want to hear more about the secrets that were never meant to be told, hit that subscribe button right now. And I'm curious, where are you listening from? Drop your state or city in the comments below. Let's see how many of you are brave enough to admit you're listening to this alone at night. Now, what really happened on that plantation involves careful planning, forbidden knowledge from the Caribbean, and a form of revenge so methodical and calculated that it would take modern forensics decades to even understand how it was accomplished. The thing about Mississippi in 1851 is that everyone kept records. With meticulous precision, plantation owners documented everything. Every bale of cotton, every slave purchased, every bushel of corn harvested. It was a society built on manifests and ledgers. On the cold arithmetic of human suffering translated into profit margins, which makes what happened at the Rutledge plantation even more disturbing, because for 3 weeks in September of that year, the records simply stop. No cotton weights, no discipline logs, no morning roll calls, just blank pages where there should have been careful accounting, as if someone had deliberately erased those weeks from history. Across 1,100 acres of prime Delta bottomland, the Rutledge plantation sprawled, situated 7 miles southeast of Vicksburg, where the Yazoo River bends like a broken spine. So dark and rich was the soil there, it looked nearly black when wet, the kind of earth that could grow cotton tall as a man's shoulder. Their knees jutting from the water like ancient sentinels, cypress trees lined the river, and in the humid stillness of late summer, the air hung thick enough to chew. From his father in 1847, Nathaniel Rutledge had inherited the property, along with 63 slaves and a reputation for brutal efficiency. A lean man he was with pale eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. And with the cold calculation of someone who viewed human beings as nothing more than machinery that occasionally required maintenance, he ran his plantation. Longer hours than most in Warren County were worked by the slaves on the Rutledge place, and a braided leather whip that he had named Salvation was used by the overseer, a thick-necked Georgian named Virgil Pence, to enforce discipline. On a slight rise overlooking the field stood the plantation house, a 2-story structure with white columns and a wraparound porch where in the evenings, Rutledge would sit, drinking bourbon and watching the sun set over the cotton that would make him wealthy. His wife had died in childbirth 3 years prior, and their son, a pale, sickly boy named Thomas, was being raised by a house slave named Patience, who had lost her own child the same week Rutledge's wife had passed. Among the 63 souls who labored in those fields, there was one who stood apart in a way that made even the other slaves uncomfortable. In the ledgers, his name was simply Caleb, acquired from a bankrupt planter in Natchez in the summer of 1848 for the unusually low price of $300. Immediately apparent was the reason for the discount. An albino was Caleb, his skin as pale as any white man's, his hair the color of cotton lint, his eyes a startling pink that seemed to glow in certain lights. He was 24 years old, tall and powerfully built. But that white skin marked him as other, as wrong, as something that existed between worlds. In the slave quarters, they called him Ghost because of his appearance, and because he moved with an eerie silence, appearing and disappearing without sound. Some said his mother had been cursed. Others claimed he was touched by spirits. But the truth, as several of the older slaves knew, was more practical and more terrifying. From Haiti, Caleb's mother had been a healer before she was captured and brought to Louisiana. She had taught her son everything she knew about plants, about poisons, about the human body, and how it could be manipulated through careful application of knowledge that white doctors dismissed as superstition. Rarely did Caleb himself speak. With methodical intensity, he worked the fields, never complaining, never slowing, his strange eyes fixed on some distant point that only he could see. Wide berth was given to him by the other slaves, not because they feared him exactly, but because they recognized something in him that made them deeply uncomfortable, a patience that seemed infinite, a stillness that suggested thoughts moving beneath the surface like currents in deep water. Particularly brutal had been the summer of 1851. The heat pressed down like a physical weight, and so thick was the humidity that clothes never fully dried. By August, 3 slaves had collapsed from heat exhaustion, and one, an older man named Marcus, had died face down in the cotton rows, his fingers still gripping the half-filled sack he had been dragging behind him. Before sunset, Rutledge had the body removed and docked each slave's rations by a quarter, claiming Marcus' death had cost him valuable working hours during peak harvest season. In this atmosphere of exhausted desperation, people began noticing changes in their environment, though at the time no one connected these changes to Caleb. Began to taste slightly bitter the well water, though not enough to refuse it in the oppressive heat. Suddenly died several of the plantation dogs, foaming at the mouth, and Pence had blamed it on rabies, though no other animals in the area showed signs of the disease. More numerous than usual seemed insects, particularly flies and mosquitoes, and several slaves developed rashes that the plantation doctor attributed to the heat and poor hygiene. In early August, Rutledge himself began complaining of headaches. More irritable than usual he became, quicker to anger, more violent in his punishments. Noticed by patients, who brought his meals, that he was eating less, that his hand sometimes shook when he lifted his bourbon glass, that he would sit on the porch for hours staring at nothing. She mentioned this to old Isaiah, one of the field hands, who had been on the plantation longer than anyone else, and something that chilled her was said by Isaiah. "Master's being prepared. Someone's getting him ready." That summer, Caleb had been working the section of field closest to the house, close enough to observe Rutledge's routines, close enough to note when the master took his meals, when he drank his bourbon, when he visited the necessary house behind the main building. Reported by several slaves later that Caleb had been collecting things, certain plants from the woods, bark from specific trees, roots that he would dry in the sun and grind into powder. When asked what he was doing, he would simply say he was making medicine for his joints, which ached from the labor. But better knew Isaiah. His grandmother had been from the islands, and she had taught him to recognize the signs of someone practicing what she had called slow work. The careful, methodical application of natural substances that could alter a person's body chemistry over time, weakening them, making them susceptible to conditions that would appear natural to any doctor who examined them. Remembered Isaac his grandmother saying that the best poisons were the ones that killed so slowly the victim never suspected they were being poisoned, that left the body in a state that mimicked natural disease. On the night of September 7th, a field hand named Samuel claimed he had followed Caleb into the woods beyond the cotton fields. He said he had watched from behind a sweet gum tree as Caleb had knelt beside the creek and carefully washed his hands and forearms with a mixture that smelled sharp and medicinal. Then Caleb had taken a small cloth bundle from his pocket and unwrapped it, revealing dried plant material that he sprinkled into the water while moving his lips in what looked like prayer, but might have been simple counting. Samuel said that when Caleb stood up, he had looked directly at the tree where Samuel was hiding, and even in the darkness, those pale eyes had found him immediately. Nothing had Caleb said, had simply stared for a long moment before turning and walking back toward the quarters. And in that moment, Samuel had understood that Caleb knew he had been watched and did not care. This story was told by Samuel to only 3 people, swearing them to secrecy. Within 2 days, all 3 had asked to be reassigned to different work details as far from Caleb as possible. Without asking questions, Pence had obliged, perhaps sensing something in their faces that made him uncomfortable asking for details. None of this was noticed by Nathaniel Rutledge. His attention that September was consumed by cotton prices and yield calculations, though his ability to focus was becoming increasingly impaired. His headaches had intensified, and he had begun experiencing episodes of dizziness and nausea. The plantation doctor, an elderly man named Hiram Kendrick, had examined him twice and could find nothing obviously wrong, though he noted that Rutledge's pulse seemed weak and irregular. A greyish cast had been taken on by his skin, and his eyes appeared slightly jaundiced. Rest and a reduction in bourbon consumption were prescribed by Dr. Kendrick, advice that Rutledge ignored. What the doctor did not know, what no one knew except Caleb, was that for 3 months, small amounts of carefully prepared plant extracts had been finding their way into Rutledge's food and drink. Not enough to cause immediate illness, but enough to gradually weaken his cardiovascular system, to make his blood vessels more fragile, to alter his blood chemistry in ways that would become catastrophic under the right conditions. From his mother, Caleb had learned that the human body could be manipulated like any other system, that with patience and knowledge, a person could be reduced to a state where a final trigger would cause complete systemic collapse. Not exotic or rare were the plants Caleb used. Pokeweed root, which grew abundantly in Mississippi and which in small doses could cause internal bleeding. White snake root, which affected blood coagulation. Foxglove leaves, which disrupted heart rhythm. Water hemlock root, which in minute quantities could damage blood vessels. Each substance was carefully measured, carefully timed, carefully administered through patients who brought Rutledge's meals, and who had lost her own child to the master's cruelty, and who asked no questions when Caleb gave her tiny vials of clear liquid to add to the bourbon decanter. By early September, a biological time bomb was Rutledge's body. So compromised was his cardiovascular system that any significant stress could trigger catastrophic failure. All that was needed was the right moment. The right trigger. On September 14, a Saturday, a decision was made by Rutledge that would seal his fate, though he had no way of knowing it at the time. He had been drinking since early afternoon, the bourbon making him more irritable than usual, and when Pence brought him the week's cotton weights, he flew into a rage. The numbers were down by nearly 12% from the previous week. Someone was slacking. Someone was stealing from him with their laziness. He demanded to know who was responsible for the shortfall. Pence, who had his own reasons for disliking Caleb, and who perhaps hoped that directing Rutledge's anger elsewhere would spare him from it, suggested that the Albino had been working slower than usual. It was a lie. Caleb's output had actually increased, but Pence had seen an opportunity and taken it. This explanation was accepted by Rutledge immediately, perhaps because it confirmed prejudices he already held. Perhaps because the bourbon had clouded his judgment, or perhaps because, like Pence, he had felt a vague discomfort around Caleb that he could not quite articulate, but could now justify as suspicion. The order was given. At sunrise on Monday, September 15, 20 lashes would be received by Caleb in front of the assembled slaves, and his rations would be cut by half for 2 weeks. Furthermore, he would be assigned to work the section of field closest to the overseer's shack, where Pence could watch him directly. The punishment was excessive, even by the harsh standards of the Rutledge plantation, and several of the older slaves exchanged worried glances when Pence announced it that evening. They had seen the way Caleb had been moving through the summer, the careful attention he had paid to everything around him, and they recognized the signs of someone preparing for something. That night, no one slept well in the slave quarters. The air felt charged, heavy with something more than humidity. Dogs in the surrounding farms barked continuously from midnight until dawn, though this was likely due to a pack of wild hogs moving through the area. Several people later reported hearing sounds they could not identify, though in the darkness and exhaustion, human perception is notoriously unreliable. 3 times from nightmares she could not remember, Patience woke. Each time with her heart racing and sweat soaking her thin blanket. In his shack at the edge of the quarters, Caleb spent that night, preparing the final element of his plan. From the rafters, he retrieved a small leather pouch that contained a powder he had been preparing for weeks. A concentrated mixture of plants that when inhaled or absorbed through mucous membranes would cause rapid vasodilation and catastrophic blood pressure collapse. The powder was extremely fine, almost like dust, and could be easily concealed and deployed. How to make it, his mother had taught him, had warned him it was dangerous even to handle. Had told him it should only be used as a last resort because once deployed, the results were irreversible and unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. he also prepared a small glass vial containing a clear liquid. Another extract, this one designed to be applied to skin where it would be absorbed transdermally and cause immediate cardiovascular crisis in someone whose system had already been compromised. The combination of months of slow poisoning followed by these two final agents would create a medical emergency so severe and so rapid that death would be inevitable, and the symptoms would mimic a natural hemorrhagic event that doctors of the era would have no way to properly diagnose or treat. With a sky like hammered pewter and air so still that nothing moved, not even the leaves on the trees, Monday morning arrived. The temperature was already 85 degrees when the wake-up bell rang at 5 o'clock, and by the time the slaves had assembled in front of the big house, the heat was oppressive, a physical weight that pressed down on shoulders and made breathing laborious. Onto his porch at 6 o'clock sharp emerged Rutledge, dressed in a white linen suit despite the early hour. He carried his bourbon glass, even though it was barely dawn, and his eyes were bloodshot from the previous night's drinking. His hand shook slightly as he set the glass down on the porch railing, and his skin had a greyish undertone that suggested his body was already in distress. Beside him stood Pence, the whip called Salvation coiled in his thick hands. In rough rows facing the porch stood the 63 slaves, their faces carefully blank, their eyes focused on nothing in particular. This was survival. Show no emotion. Reveal no thoughts. Become invisible even while standing in full view. Bring out the albino, Rutledge said, his voice carrying clearly in the dead air, though it sounded strained, as if speaking required effort. From the quarters, Caleb emerged, walking slowly, each step measured and deliberate. Shirtless he was, his pale torso almost luminous in the growing light, and there were marks on his arms, deliberate scars that he had given himself over the years, each one representing a person he had lost to slavery's cruelty, each one a reminder of why he was doing what he was doing. Fixed on Rutledge with an intensity that made several slaves look away were his pink eyes. With purpose he moved, like someone approaching the culmination of long planning. He stopped 10 feet from the porch and stood perfectly still, his hands loose at his sides, his breathing slow and regular. Concealed against his palm in his right hand was the small leather pouch containing the powder. Hidden against his wrist in his left hand was the tiny glass vial. This moment he had practiced in his mind 1,000 times, had planned every movement, had calculated every risk. Toward him moved Pence with the whip, but something made the overseer pause. Later, he would tell the county sheriff that he had felt uneasy, that something about Caleb's stillness had been unnerving, though he could not articulate why. But Rutledge was watching, and pride pushed Pence forward. Strip him to the waist and tie him to the post, Rutledge ordered, though Caleb was already shirtless. 2 slaves, men who had known Caleb for 3 years, but had never felt comfortable around him, approached cautiously. They took his arms to lead him to the whipping post, a thick timber sunk deep into the earth specifically for this purpose. But as they grasped his arms, suddenly twisted Caleb, breaking their grip with surprising strength. And before anyone could react, he had moved forward, closing the distance to Rutledge in 3 quick steps. "You will not touch me," Caleb said, his voice low, but carrying clearly. "Not with that whip. Not ever again." Rutledge's face went pale, then flushed red with rage. He descended the porch steps, moving toward Caleb with his fists clenched, his judgment impaired by bourbon and mounting fury. "You dare refuse me? You dare speak to me like that?" This was exactly what Caleb had been waiting for. Rutledge close enough to touch, his blood pressure already elevated by anger, his compromised cardiovascular system pushed to its limits by rage and alcohol. As Rutledge reached for him, 2 movements were made by Caleb so quick that most witnesses would later disagree on exactly what they had seen. First, he crushed the leather pouch in his right hand, releasing the fine powder directly into Rutledge's face. Reflexively, the master inhaled, gasping in shock and anger, drawing the powder deep into his lungs where it would be rapidly absorbed into his bloodstream. Second, as Rutledge staggered back, coughing and sputtering, out shot Caleb's left hand and made contact with Rutledge's chest just above his heart. The touch lasted less than a second, but it was long enough for the liquid from the broken vial, which Caleb had crushed against his own palm, to transfer to Rutledge's skin through his thin linen shirt. The effect was not instantaneous, but it was rapid. The powder inhaled into Rutledge's lungs caused immediate severe vasodilation, dropping his blood pressure catastrophically. The liquid absorbed through his chest caused his already compromised heart to begin beating irregularly, too fast and then too slow, unable to maintain adequate circulation, and his blood vessels, weakened by months of slow poisoning, began to rupture internally. Rutledge froze. His hands went to his chest, clutching at the place where Caleb had touched him. His eyes widened with confusion and the first edge of terror, and then, with everyone watching, a red stain began to spread across the white linen of his shirt, directly where Caleb had touched him. But there was no external wound. What was happening was internal hemorrhaging so severe that blood was being forced through the pores of his skin, through his sweat glands, seeping out through intact skin in a way that would have been medically impossible without the specific combination of substances Caleb had administered over months. From Rutledge's nose, from his ears, from the corners of his eyes, blood began running. His mouth filled with blood as internal bleeding in his lungs made him cough up dark, thick streams of it. Backward staggered Rutledge, his hands clutching at his chest, his eyes wide with confusion and dawning horror. He tried to speak, but blood came from his mouth instead of words, thick and dark, running over his chin and down his neck. He looked at Caleb with an expression that mixed incomprehension with terror, and back looked Caleb with eyes that held something that might have been satisfaction, might have been vindication, might have been simple acknowledgement that a long-planned action had finally been executed. "Walk to the field," Caleb said quietly, his voice steady. "Walk to the center of your cotton where you have built your wealth on our bodies. Walk there and know what you have done." And remarkably, impossibly, turned Rutledge and began walking toward the cotton fields. Medical science would later suggest that he was in shock, that his brain was starved of oxygen, that he was acting on some final autonomic impulse. But in that moment, it looked as if he was obeying Caleb's command, as if the albino slave had somehow taken control of the dying man's final moments. Stiff, mechanical were Rutledge's movements, and blood continued to flow from his chest, from his mouth, from his nose and ears, soaking his white suit until it was entirely red. He left a trail of crimson drops in the dust, each one marking his path, each one soaking into the earth he had worked slaves to exhaustion to cultivate. Paralyzed stood Pence, his mouth working soundlessly. In silence watched the assembled slaves, and though many of them hated Rutledge with an intensity that had sustained them through years of brutality, what they saw in that moment was something beyond simple murder. It was execution, methodical and planned, carried out by someone who had spent months preparing, who had used knowledge most of them did not possess, who had turned the master's own body into a weapon against itself. The edge of the cotton field was reached by Rutledge and he pushed between the rows, the tall plant swallowing him from view. But the slaves could track his progress by the swaying of the cotton tops, by the wet sounds that carried across the still morning air, by the crows that suddenly erupted from the field in a black cloud, calling their alarm to the indifferent sky. Motionless stood Caleb, watching Rutledge disappear into the cotton. At his sides hung his hands, stained red from the broken vial and from where Rutledge's blood had splattered onto him. Controlled and even was his breathing, and no emotion at all showed on his face. For 3 years he had planned this moment, from the day he had been purchased and had recognized in Rutledge the same cruelty he had seen in his previous owners, the same casual violence, the same absolute conviction that human beings could be owned and used and discarded. 10 minutes passed, 15. The sun cleared the horizon, turning the sky from grey to pale blue, and the heat built with an intensity that felt personal, vindictive. No one moved. No one spoke. They waited, though for what, none of them could have said with certainty. They were waiting to see if Rutledge would emerge from the field. They were waiting to see what Caleb would do next. They were waiting for reality to reassert itself and make sense of what they had witnessed. Finally, the swaying cotton fell still. The wet sound ceased. A silence descended that felt absolute, as if the world had stopped breathing. To face the assembled slaves turned Caleb. He looked at each of them in turn. His pale eyes moving from face to face, and then he spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. He died from his own cruelty, from years of bad living, bad drinking, bad choices. His body gave out because he drove it as hard as he drove us. The doctor will find nothing that points to anything except natural causes. A hemorrhagic event, a stroke, a heart failure, something his body was always going to do eventually. I simply made sure it happened today in front of all of you so you would know that monsters are not invincible. They are just men, and men can die. Then to the quarters walked Caleb, gathered his few possessions, and disappeared into the woods before Pence recovered enough presence of mind to try to stop him. By the time the overseer organized any response, gone was Caleb and he would never be found despite extensive searches. The immediate aftermath was chaos constrained by terror. Pence, who had finally regained the ability to move, wanted to run into the field immediately to check on Rutledge. But something, call it instinct, call it the primal part of the brain that recognizes danger before conscious thought can process it, kept him rooted to the spot for several more minutes. When he finally forced himself to move, he grabbed 3 slaves he considered reliable men who had been on the plantation for years, who had never caused trouble, and ordered them at gunpoint to accompany him into the field. They followed the trail of blood drops that Rutledge had left, the crimson spots already turning brown in the sun, each one marking his path like some terrible breadcrumb trail. The cotton plants were taller than usual that year, nearly 7 feet high, and moving between the rows felt like walking through a maze. The leaves brushed against their skin with a sound like whispering, and flies had begun to gather, their buzzing growing louder as the group pushed deeper into the field. They found Rutledge in a clearing at the center of the field, in a spot where the cotton had been planted in a circular pattern around a space perhaps 10 feet in diameter. On his back he was lying, his arms spread wide, his legs straight. His white suit was now entirely red, soaked through with blood, and more blood had pooled beneath him, soaking into the earth in a dark stain that would remain visible for weeks. But it was his face that made 2 of the 3 slaves turn and run immediately, leaving Pence and the remaining man, an older slave named Isaiah, staring down in horror. Paper white was Rutledge's skin, so pale it was nearly translucent, drained of blood to a degree that seemed impossible. Open were his eyes, staring upward at the sky, but they were filmed over and colorless. Slack hung his mouth, and bleached looked his tongue. Every visible inch of skin was covered in tiny red dots, petechiae, where capillaries had ruptured and bled beneath the surface. Blood had dried in streams from his nose, his ears, the corners of his eyes, his mouth. But despite the obvious horror of his death, despite what must have been agonizing as his blood vessels ruptured throughout his body, neither pain nor fear showed on Rutledge's face. Instead, he looked almost peaceful, almost relaxed, and this was perhaps the most disturbing detail of all. The expression suggested that in his final moments, his brain starved of oxygen and flooded with endorphins, he had experienced something like relief, like release, as if death had been a mercy compared to whatever terror had gripped him in those final minutes of consciousness. Isaiah, who had seen more death in his 60 years than any man should, took one look at that expression and said a single word: poison. Pence asked what he meant, and Isaiah shook his head. Not regular poison that kills you quick. Something slow. Something careful. This took planning. This took knowledge. That ghost knew what he was doing. He has been preparing Master Rutledge for this moment for months, and none of us saw it. An examination by Dr. Hiram Kendrick later that afternoon would confirm Isaiah's suspicions, though the doctor would never speak of it publicly. Old enough and experienced enough was Kendrick to recognize the signs of systematic poisoning when he saw them. Enlarged was Rutledge's liver and showed signs of toxic damage. His kidneys were inflamed. Evidence of chronic stress and damage to blood vessel walls was shown by his cardiovascular system. Not spontaneous was the massive hemorrhaging that had killed him. It was the final result of months of careful preparation, the culmination of a plan that had weakened every system in Rutledge's body until a final trigger could cause complete collapse. Dr. Kendrick found traces of plant material in Rutledge's lungs, a fine powder that he could not identify, but which had clearly been inhaled shortly before death. He found chemical burns on Rutledge's chest where some caustic substance had been absorbed through the skin. He estimated that nearly 5 quarts of blood had been lost by Rutledge, most of it internally, and that the hemorrhaging had occurred through thousands of ruptured capillaries throughout his entire body, a medical event so catastrophic that Kendrick had never seen anything like it in 40 years of practice. This was murder, Kendrick wrote in his preliminary notes, which he carefully sealed and hid. Sophisticated, calculated, and executed with knowledge that rivals or exceeds my own medical training. The perpetrator understood human physiology, understood pharmacology, understood exactly how to weaken a human body over time, and then deliver a final blow that would cause system-wide failure. This was not the work of an ignorant field hand. This was the work of someone with extensive training in the use of natural substances as weapons. But Dr. Kendrick also understood the implications of making such a statement publicly. To admit that a slave had possessed the knowledge and skill to commit such a sophisticated murder would be to admit that slaves were not the ignorant childlike beings that white society insisted they were. It would be to acknowledge that knowledge could be preserved and passed down even under the brutal conditions of slavery. That resistance could take forms far more sophisticated than simple rebellion or escape. And it would open questions about how many other deaths attributed to natural causes might actually have been carefully planned executions. So, Dr. Kendrick wrote a second report, the official one that would go into the public record. In this version, he attributed Rutledge's death to spontaneous hemorrhagic fever, possibly related to chronic alcohol consumption and a congenital weakness in the blood vessel walls. He made no mention of poisoning. He made no mention of the powder in the lungs or the chemical burns on the chest. He created a narrative that would allow society to avoid uncomfortable truths. The county sheriff, Silas Hardwick, arrived for that afternoon. A practical man, he was with 30 years of experience in law enforcement, and he approached the scene with the systematic thoroughness that had made him respected throughout Warren County. He interviewed Pence first, then several of the house slaves, carefully noting each statement. But contradictory and confusing were the stories he heard. Some slaves said Caleb had attacked Rutledge. Others said Rutledge had approached Caleb in anger. Some claimed Caleb had thrown something in Rutledge's face. Others said he had simply touched him. No one could agree on exactly what had happened in those crucial seconds. When Sheriff Hardwick went to the slave quarters to examine Caleb's shack, he found it empty of anything useful. Caleb's few possessions, a blanket, a tin cup, a spare shirt, were still there, but there was no evidence of the preparations he must have made. No vials of powder or liquid, no dried plants or roots, no tools or implements. Either Caleb had taken everything with him, or he had destroyed it before leaving, or perhaps it had never existed in a form that would be recognizable as evidence. Immediately organized Hardwick a search party. 20 men with dogs combed the plantation and the surrounding woods, looking for any trace of the missing slave. The dogs picked up his scent easily enough and followed it to the edge of the Yazoo River at a muddy bank where a single set of footprints led into the water and disappeared. The men searched both banks for miles in each direction but found nothing. No footprints emerging. No signs of a body in the water. Nothing. Either he drowned, Sheriff Hardwick said, or he crossed the river and kept moving fast enough that the dogs lost his scent on the other side. They dragged the river for 3 days, more out of thoroughness than any real expectation of finding anything. They never found a body, which was not particularly surprising. The Yazoo River was deep and had strong currents in places, and bodies caught in submerged debris might never surface, but several members of the search party privately believed that Caleb had not drowned, that he had crossed the river and was already miles away, moving north toward free territory with the same careful planning he had used to kill Rutledge. The inquest into Nathaniel Rutledge's death was held on September 20th, 5 days after his death. The courthouse in Vicksburg was packed with curious onlookers, and the testimony lasted 8 hours. Pence described what he had seen, though his account was vague and contradictory on key details. Dr. Kendrick testified about his findings, carefully presenting the official narrative of natural causes. Several slaves were called to testify, though under Mississippi law, their testimony was given less weight than that of white witnesses, and their accounts were largely dismissed as confused and unreliable. The verdict was recorded as death by spontaneous hemorrhagic event, natural causes. A reward of $500 was posted for Caleb's capture, dead or alive, not for murder, but for being a fugitive slave who had fled his legal owner's property. Sheriff Hardwick sent descriptions to every county in Mississippi and to law enforcement in neighboring states. Newspapers published accounts of the Albino fugitive and warned citizens to be on the lookout for a dangerous runaway. But the people who had been there, who had seen what actually happened, knew the truth. In the slave quarters, they spoke in whispers about what Caleb had done, about the patience and knowledge it must have taken, about the months of careful preparation. Some said his mother had taught him secrets from Haiti, old knowledge about plants and poisons that white doctors did not understand. Others claimed he had learned from other slaves who had been healers in Africa before they were captured. A few insisted he had taught himself, had experimented and studied and learned through careful observation over years of slavery. Patience, who had unwittingly helped Caleb by adding the substances to Rutledge's food and drink, told the others something that chilled them. 3 days before it happened, Caleb came to me with a small vial. He said it was medicine for Master's headaches, that it would help him rest. He told me exactly how much to put in the bourbon decanter, and he made me repeat the instructions 3 times. And then he looked at me and said, "In 3 days, you will be free of him. In 3 days, his cruelty ends. Do not question. Do not hesitate. Just do as I have asked." I thought he meant Master would sell us or die of natural causes. I did not understand what he was really planning until it was too late to stop it. And the terrible thing is I do not regret it. None of us do. Young Thomas Rutledge never fully recovered from that morning. The boy had watched everything from an upstairs window, had seen his father die in a way that no child should witness, and the trauma left deep psychological scars. He stopped speaking for nearly a year, and when he finally began talking again, he would sometimes wake screaming from nightmares about the white ghost who made father bleed. Doctors examined him and found nothing physically wrong. But the boy had retreated into some interior space where normal childhood could not reach him. He would live another 43 years cared for by various relatives, never marrying, never working, spending his days staring out windows and sometimes pointing at nothing visible, muttering words that no one could quite make out. The plantation was sold at auction 6 months later. The slaves were distributed among several buyers, deliberately separated to prevent them from discussing what they had witnessed. The new owners found the property difficult to work. Several overseers quit within weeks, claiming the slaves were unsettled and unresponsive, though the real reason was likely that the story of what had happened had spread, and no white man wanted to be the next victim of similar treatment. The cotton field where Rutledge had died was plowed under and replanted, but the soil in that central circle where his body had lain never produced healthy plants again. For 3 consecutive growing seasons, cotton planted in that spot withered and died, the leaves turning yellow and falling off prematurely. Agricultural experts examined the soil and found nothing obviously wrong, though privately some suggested that the massive amount of blood that had soaked into the earth might have altered its chemistry in ways that inhibited plant growth. By 1854, the new owner had abandoned the property entirely, and the fields returned to wilderness. The story might have ended there, fading into local legend, except for what emerged years later through the testimonies of people who had been there and who after emancipation felt free to speak more openly about what they had witnessed and understood. In 1874, 23 years after Rutledge's death, Isaiah Carmichael, the same Isaiah who had gone into the field with Pence that terrible morning, was dying of pneumonia in a freedman's hospital in Memphis. He had spent the years after emancipation working as a carpenter, living quietly, raising a family. But on his deathbed, with his grown children gathered around him, he suddenly began speaking about September 15, 1851, providing details he had kept silent about for more than 2 decades. What Isaiah revealed was recorded by a hospital chaplain named Reverend Marcus Sullivan, who had made a practice of documenting the last testimonies of formerly enslaved people, believing their stories deserved to be preserved. Sullivan's notebooks, discovered in a church archive in 1947, contained 17 pages devoted to Isaiah's confession. According to Isaiah, the events of that morning did not begin with the confrontation between Caleb and Rutledge. They began 3 months earlier in June of 1851 when Caleb had asked Isaiah to help him with something. Reluctant had been Isaiah. Like everyone else, he had felt uncomfortable around the albino. But extra food from his own rations had been offered by Caleb, and Isaiah's children were hungry, so he had agreed. Into the woods at midnight on the night of the summer solstice had Caleb led him, though the significance of that particular night was likely more psychological than practical. Understood Caleb that creating an atmosphere of ritual and secrecy would ensure Isaiah's silence. There, in a clearing beside the creek, Isaiah had watched as Caleb had shown him various plants growing wild in the Mississippi woods. He knew every plant by name, Isaiah said on his deathbed, his voice barely above a whisper. Not the names white folks used, but old names, names from the islands and from Africa. He showed me poke and told me how the root could be dried and ground into powder that would cause bleeding inside the body if taken in small amounts over time. He showed me white snake root and explained how it poisoned the milk of cows that ate it and how that same poison could be extracted and used to thin a man's blood until it would not clot properly. He showed me foxglove and described how it could make a heartbeat irregular, could weaken it over months until it was ready to fail. He showed me water hemlock and demonstrated how to prepare the root so it would damage blood vessels without killing immediately. Isaiah said that Caleb had been collecting these plants since his arrival at the plantation 3 years earlier, learning the landscape, identifying the species he needed, waiting for the right opportunity. He told me he had done this before, Isaiah said. He told me his mother had taught him because she knew that as an albino he would always be treated worse than other slaves. Would always be considered strange and threatening, would always be the first one blamed when things went wrong. She taught him how to protect himself, how to strike back when necessary, how to use knowledge as a weapon when physical strength was not enough. Over the next 3 months, Isaiah said Caleb had prepared his substances carefully. He had dried and ground the plant materials, had tested them on rats and stray dogs to determine proper dosages, had created mixtures that would be tasteless and colorless when added to food or drink. He had convinced patients to help him by telling her that the substances were medicine that would make Rutledge less cruel, would calm his rages, would make life easier for all of them. Patients had believed him because she wanted to believe him because the alternative was to continue living under Rutledge's brutal authority. Caleb told me the key was patience, Isaiah said, his breathing growing more labored. He said most poisons kill too quickly, make it obvious that murder has occurred. But if you weaken a man slowly over months, making him sick in ways that look like natural illness, then when the final moment comes, when you deliver the substance that causes his weakened body to collapse entirely, it looks like he simply died of bad health. He told me he had learned this watching white doctors, watching how they treated diseases, understanding that the human body was just a system like any other system, and systems could be manipulated if you understood their mechanisms. The final substances that Caleb had used on the morning of September 15 had been the culmination of months of preparation. The powder he had thrown in Rutledge's face was a concentrated mixture designed to be inhaled to enter the bloodstream through the lungs and cause rapid vasodilation. The sudden expansion of blood vessels that would drop blood pressure catastrophically in someone whose cardiovascular system had already been compromised. The liquid he had applied to Rutledge's chest was an extract that could be absorbed through skin, especially thin skin like that covering the chest, and that would cause the heart to beat erratically, failing to pump blood effectively. He told me the hemorrhaging would be spectacular, Isaiah said. He said Rutledge's body was so weakened that when these final substances took effect, blood vessels throughout his body would rupture. He said it would look impossible, would look like something supernatural, but it was just chemistry and biology. He said it was justice rendered in the only form available to someone with no legal recourse, no rights, no protection under law. He said it was mathematics, balancing an equation where one man's life and freedom had been stolen, so another man's life would be taken in return. Isaiah died 3 hours after finishing his account, and Reverend Sullivan sealed the testimony in an envelope marked not to be opened before 1900. His reasoning, recorded in a separate letter, was that publishing such an account, while racial tensions remained high, could endanger freed black communities by reinforcing white fears about the knowledge that enslaved people possessed. Better to wait, he reasoned, until time had created enough distance for the story to be examined rationally and historically rather than emotionally. But Isaiah's testimony was not the only evidence that surfaced in the years following Rutledge's death. In 1881, a historian named Margaret Chambers was researching plantation records for a book about the antebellum South when she discovered something unusual in the Natchez courthouse archives. Among the slave sale records from 1848, she found the receipt for Caleb's purchase. The transaction where Rutledge had acquired him for the unusually low price of $300. The selling planter's name was René Toussaint, and the notation beside Caleb's name read, Albino male, age 21, strong constitution, unsuitable for house service due to disturbing appearance. Warning: previous owner deceased under suspicious circumstances. Recommend sale outside Louisiana Territory. Additional note: claims mother was healer from Saint-Domingue. Medical examination shows knowledge of plants and herbs. Purchaser assumes all risk. Margaret Chambers tracked down additional records related to Toussaint's plantation. She discovered that the previous owner mentioned in the warning was a man named Jacques Beauregard who had died in March of 1848 from what the death certificate described as spontaneous hemorrhaging from all mucous membranes and vital organs. 3 slaves from that plantation had been sold immediately after Beauregard's death, and one of them was Caleb. When Chambers tried to trace Caleb's history before Beauregard, she found the records became increasingly sparse and contradictory, likely because slaves were often deliberately misidentified or had their records falsified to hide problematic histories. One bill of sale listed his birthplace as Haiti. Another claimed he had been born in New Orleans. A third insisted he had been purchased from a slave trader in Mobile. The conflicting information made it impossible to construct a coherent timeline, and Chambers began to suspect the records had been deliberately obscured by slave traders who knew they were dealing with a dangerous individual, but wanted to make sales anyway. What she did find was a pattern. In every location where Caleb had been enslaved, she found reports of an owner or overseer dying under unusual circumstances. A plantation in Louisiana where the master was found dead in a tobacco barn. His body drained of blood from massive internal hemorrhaging. A farm in Alabama where the overseer's body was discovered in a field, bloodless and pale as marble. A cotton gin in Georgia where the owner had collapsed and died while disciplining a slave, blood pouring from his eyes and ears. In each case, an albino slave had been present on the property. In each case, that slave had vanished or been sold shortly after the death. And in each case, local authorities had written off the deaths as natural causes, accidents, or the result of tropical diseases. No one wanted to believe that a slave, especially one as obviously marked as an albino, could possess the knowledge and planning ability to commit such sophisticated murders. Margaret Chambers never published her findings. Her notes, discovered after her death in 1903, suggest she had become convinced that she was tracing not a series of unrelated coincidences, but rather a single individual moving through the South, changing owners when necessary, settling accounts with those who treated him most cruelly, using knowledge passed down from his mother to survive, and occasionally to strike back. But the implications of such a theory were too disturbing for the time period, and she had sealed her research with instructions that it not be made public until 1950. If I am right, she wrote in her private journal, then Caleb represents something that white society has always feared but never wanted to acknowledge, that enslaved people possess intelligence, knowledge, and agency equal to or exceeding that of their oppressors. That they remember everything done to them. That they pass down knowledge across generations, that they are capable of sophisticated long-term planning, that they can use the tools of science and medicine as effectively as any trained physician, and that when pushed beyond endurance, they can deliver justice in forms that white legal systems would never recognize as valid, but which are nonetheless devastatingly effective. Meanwhile, reports of Caleb's survival and movements continued to surface sporadically over the years following his disappearance. In 1856, a riverboat captain on the Ohio River reported giving passage to an albino man who claimed to be a freed slave heading to Canada. The captain noted in his log that the man had paid in gold coins and that his hands were covered in scars that looked like deliberate patterns, possibly self-inflicted as a form of identification or record-keeping. "He was the politest passenger I ever carried," the captain wrote. But there was something in his manner that suggested he had seen and done things that would haunt most men forever. He spoke little, but watched everything, and I had the distinct impression he was cataloguing every detail of the journey, as if committing it to memory for some future use. In 1863, during the Battle of Gettysburg, a Union surgeon named Dr. Henry Walsh reported treating a soldier with unusual scarring who claimed to be an escaped slave fighting under an assumed name. Dr. Walsh noted that the soldier's appearance was remarkably pale, almost albino, and that he possessed medical knowledge that exceeded that of most field surgeons. "He assisted me with several amputations and demonstrated techniques for controlling hemorrhaging that I had never seen before," Walsh wrote. "When I asked where he had learned such skills, he said his mother had been a healer and had taught him everything she knew. He said knowledge was the only thing that could not be taken from a slave, the only form of resistance that was impossible to suppress. The soldier had told Walsh that he was fighting in the war not out of patriotism, but out of a belief that the destruction of slavery required the destruction of the economic and social systems that supported it. He said the war was justice being delivered on a national scale. Walsh recorded the accumulated debts of generations being settled in blood and fire. He said he had spent years settling individual accounts, but this war would settle the larger account, the one that encompassed millions of stolen lives and generations of suffering. He said he would survive the war because he had survived worse, and that when it was over, he would continue his work in whatever form was necessary. Dr. Walsh never saw the soldier again after the battle, but he kept detailed notes about their conversations. Notes that would be discovered in 1923 and would add to the growing body of evidence that someone matching Caleb's description had survived his escape from Mississippi and had continued moving through American history, adapting to changing circumstances but maintaining the same core purpose. In 1879, a missionary teacher in a freedman school in South Carolina reported an unusual visitor who came to observe her classes. She described him in a letter to her sponsors as a remarkably pale Negro man with white hair and pink eyes who claimed to have been born in slavery, but who possessed education that rivaled or exceeded my own. The teacher, Sarah Grimke, wrote that the visitor had donated a substantial sum of money to the school, more than $200 in gold, and had told her something she found both inspiring and unsettling. He said, "Education was the key to ensuring that the crimes of slavery would never be forgotten or repeated," Grimke wrote. He said that every child who learned to read and write was a witness who could testify to history, who could preserve memory across generations, who could ensure that truth would eventually prevail over the lies that had sustained slavery. But he also said something darker. He said that some debts could never be fully repaid, that some crimes were so great that justice could only be approximated, never achieved. He said he had spent his life trying to balance accounts that were fundamentally unbalanceable, and that the frustration of that impossible task was its own form of torture. I asked him why he continued if he believed the task was impossible. And he looked at me with eyes that seemed far older than his apparent age and said, "Because someone must, because memory must be honored, because the dead deserve to have their suffering acknowledged, even if it cannot be undone." These scattered reports collected by various researchers over the decades never amounted to definitive proof that a single individual had survived from 1848 through 1879 and beyond. They could be explained as different people with similar appearances and similar backgrounds. But taken together, they suggested something else. That Caleb had indeed escaped successfully, had made his way north, had survived the Civil War, and had continued living with the knowledge of what he had done and what had been done to him. The most disturbing evidence emerged in 1911, 60 years after Rutledge's death, when the Yazoo River flooded catastrophically, submerging large portions of Warren County beneath 15 feet of muddy water. When the waters receded 3 weeks later, the landscape had been fundamentally altered. The river had jumped its banks and carved a new channel, exposing sections of bottomland that had been underwater or buried in silt for decades. Among the debris and mud left behind, workers cleaning up near the site of the old Rutledge plantation made a discovery that would restart the investigation into events from 60 years earlier. Buried in a mudbank, wrapped in oilcloth, and sealed in a metal box that had protected them from water damage, they found the personal journals of Nathaniel Rutledge, covering the period from January 1851 to September 14, 1851, the day before his death. The journals were turned over to the County Historical Society, where they sat for 3 years before anyone read them carefully. When they were finally examined by a local historian named Thomas Everett in 1914, they revealed details that fundamentally changed the understanding of what had happened in September 1851. According to his journal entries, Rutledge had been aware that something was wrong with his health. Starting in late June 1851, he described experiencing persistent headaches, episodes of dizziness, and unusual fatigue. He had consulted Dr. Kendrick multiple times, but the doctor had found nothing obviously wrong and had attributed the symptoms to stress and excessive drinking. Rutledge had initially accepted this diagnosis, but as the weeks progressed and his symptoms intensified, he had begun to suspect something else was happening. "I am beginning to fear that I have been poisoned," Rutledge wrote on August 15. "My symptoms do not match any natural illness I have experienced or read about. The headaches come and go without pattern. My vision blurs unexpectedly. I feel weakness in my limbs that has no obvious cause, and most disturbing, I have noticed small spots of blood appearing on my pillow in the mornings, as if I am bleeding from my nose or mouth during sleep, though I never feel it happening. Dr. Kendrick dismisses my concerns and suggests I'm imagining things, but I know my own body, and something is systematically wrong with it. The journal entries from late August and early September showed Rutledge's suspicions crystallizing into certainty. He began noting everything he ate and drank, trying to identify a pattern. He began suspecting various slaves of tampering with his food, but his focus kept returning to one individual, though he seemed reluctant to name him directly in the journals. "The albino watches me," Rutledge wrote on September 3rd. "I see him in the fields, and his eyes follow me as I ride past. There is something in that gaze that unsettles me profoundly. Not hatred, which I could understand and respond to with punishment. Not fear, which would be appropriate and satisfying, but rather a kind of patient calculation, as if he is measuring me for something, as if he is waiting for a specific moment that only he can recognize. I have considered selling him, but the financial loss would be significant, and I would have to explain why I am selling a strong worker in the middle of harvest season. What would I say? That I fear him? That his stare makes me uncomfortable? I would be mocked." The entries from September 10th through September 14th showed Rutledge's physical and mental state deteriorating rapidly. He described tasting bitterness in his bourbon that had not been there before. He reported seeing blood in his urine. He noted that his gums bled when he brushed his teeth, that bruises appeared on his skin without any memory of injury, that his heart seemed to beat irregularly, skipping beats and then racing to catch up. Just when we thought we had seen it all, the horror in Warren County intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The final entry, dated September 14th, the night before his death, was barely legible. The handwriting shaky and increasingly erratic as the entry progressed. I know now what is happening to me. I consulted a medical text that Dr. Kendrick left behind after his last visit, and I have identified my symptoms as consistent with systematic poisoning by plant-based substances. The specific combination suggests someone with sophisticated knowledge of pharmacology far beyond what any slave should possess. But I remember now that when I purchased the albino from Toussaint, the seller warned me that the slave's mother had been some kind of healer or medicine woman from Haiti. I dismissed this as superstitious nonsense, but now I understand it was a warning. I should have heeded. The albino has been poisoning me for months, carefully and methodically, weakening my body in preparation for some final action. I can see it clearly now, though the realization comes too late to save me. He has been using patients to deliver the substances in my food and drink. The innocent girl not understanding that she is an instrument of murder. He has been patient in ways I cannot fathom, waiting months to achieve his goal, displaying a capacity for long-term planning that contradicts everything I have been taught about the mental capabilities of his race. I could report my suspicions to Sheriff Hardwick, but what proof do I have? A feeling of being watched. Vague suspicions about an albino slave. The sheriff would think me paranoid or drunk. I could free all my slaves and flee. Could abandon this plantation and start over somewhere else. But my pride will not allow it. I have built this place with my own hands, have created wealth from nothing, and I will not be driven from it by a slave, no matter how clever or dangerous. Tomorrow I will confront him publicly. I will have him whipped in front of all the others, will reassert my authority, will show that I am not afraid. Perhaps this will force his hand prematurely before whatever final action he has planned is ready. Or perhaps I am already doomed and tomorrow will simply be the day my weakened body finally fails. If so, I pray that my death serves as a warning to others. Never underestimate the enslaved. They remember everything. They learn everything. And given the right knowledge and enough patience, they can destroy you as surely as any army, as thoroughly as any disease. Thomas Everett, who discovered these journal entries, was deeply troubled by what they revealed. Unlike the official narrative that had been constructed in 1851, a narrative of unprovoked attack by a violent slave, Rutledge's own words proved that he had understood exactly what was being done to him, had identified Caleb as the perpetrator, and had made a conscious decision to confront him anyway. Driven by pride and by an unwillingness to admit that a slave could outwit him, Everett began investigating further, looking for any other documentation that might shed light on the events. He found the sealed coroner's notes from 1851, which Dr. Kendrick had hidden away. Reading them alongside Rutledge's journal created a complete picture of what had happened. Months of careful poisoning using plant extracts, culminating in a final application of substances that triggered catastrophic hemorrhaging in a body that had been systematically weakened and prepared for exactly that outcome. What emerges from these documents, Everett wrote in his analysis, is not a story of supernatural revenge or divine justice, but rather a case study in sophisticated murder carried out by someone with extensive knowledge of human physiology and pharmacology. Caleb was not a monster or a ghost or a supernatural being. He was simply a highly intelligent man who had been taught valuable knowledge by his mother and who used that knowledge to survive in a system designed to destroy him. When that system threatened to destroy him through excessive punishment, he defended himself in the only way available to him by eliminating the threat. Everett published his findings in 1915 in a limited edition monograph titled The Albino's Revenge, a study in antebellum murder. The book sold poorly and was largely dismissed by mainstream historians as sensationalistic, though medical professionals who read it recognized the accuracy of Everett's analysis of the poisoning methodology. The book caught the attention of several researchers interested in the ways enslaved people had resisted their bondage, and it contributed to a growing understanding that resistance took many forms, not all of them dramatic or immediately visible. One of these researchers, an anthropologist named Dr. Sarah Osgood, traveled to Haiti in 1922 to investigate the traditions of healing and plant medicine that might have been passed down to people like Caleb's mother. There she interviewed several traditional healers who confirmed that such knowledge had indeed existed and had been carefully preserved even after the Middle Passage. The healers I spoke with described extensive pharmacological knowledge that had been developed over centuries in Africa and refined in the Caribbean, Dr. Osgood wrote in her field notes, they could identify hundreds of plants by sight, and knew their properties, which ones could heal, which ones could kill, which ones could be used in combination to achieve specific effects. This knowledge was considered sacred and was typically passed only from parent to child, or from master to apprentice within secret societies. The fact that an enslaved woman would teach such knowledge to her son suggests she understood he would need every possible advantage to survive. Dr. Osgood's research confirmed that the substances Caleb had used were all native to Mississippi or could have been found growing wild in the region. Pokeweed, white snake root, foxglove, and water hemlock were all common plants that knowledgeable people understood could be dangerous if used improperly or effectively if used with intent. The sophistication lay not in using exotic or rare substances, but in understanding dosages, timing, and combinations that would achieve the desired effect without being immediately obvious. What Caleb accomplished required extensive knowledge, careful observation, meticulous planning, and extraordinary patience, Dr. Osgood concluded. It also required a willingness to accept that he might die in the attempt, that his plan might be discovered, that he might face torture and execution if caught. The fact that he succeeded, that he escaped, and that he apparently survived for decades afterward suggests a level of intelligence, courage, and determination that should force us to reconsider every assumption we have made about the capabilities and agency of enslaved people. The final piece of the puzzle emerged in the most unexpected way through a source that initially seemed questionable, but which ultimately provided crucial confirmation of the entire narrative. In 1947, 96 years after Rutledge's death, a package arrived at the Warren County Historical Society, postmarked from Toronto, Canada. It had been mailed anonymously and contained a handwritten letter along with a small leather-bound journal. The letter was brief and written in careful, educated handwriting. I am sending you the personal journal of a man who called himself Caleb, though that was not his birth name. I found this journal among my grandfather's possessions after his death last year. My grandfather was a conductor on the Underground Railroad and helped many escaped slaves reach Canada in the years before and during the Civil War. Caleb was one of those he helped, and they remained friends until my grandfather's death in 1893. Caleb gave him this journal shortly before Caleb's own death in 1895, asking that it be preserved and eventually made public once enough time had passed that the truth could be told without endangering anyone. I believe enough time has now passed. The people described in these pages are long dead. The system they represented has been destroyed, but the story deserves to be known, both as a testament to one man's resistance and as a warning about what human beings become capable of when pushed to extremes. The journal itself was remarkable. Written in a neat, precise hand, it covered Caleb's life from approximately 1845 through 1893. Though it was not a daily diary, but rather a series of reflective entries written at various points over nearly 50 years, the entries were not dated precisely, but were marked by location and by significant events. The earliest entries described Caleb's childhood in Haiti, where his mother, a woman of mixed African and European ancestry, who had been born free, but was later enslaved during political upheavals, had taught him everything she knew about healing and about plants. She had taught him to read and write in secret using a Bible she had hidden. She had taught him about the human body, about how it functioned and how it could malfunction. And she had taught him something else, something that would shape the rest of his life. My mother told me that knowledge was power. Caleb wrote in one of the earliest entries, but that for someone like me, marked by my white skin as different, treated with suspicion and fear by both blacks and whites, knowledge had to be hidden, knowledge applied carefully and sparingly. She said, I would never be able to live as a normal man, would never be fully accepted by any community, would always be seen as strange and threatening. Therefore, I had to make my strangeness my strength. I had to become someone who understood more than others, who could see patterns they could not see, who could plan further ahead than they could imagine. She said I would have to be patient beyond normal human patience, and that I would have to accept loneliness as the price of survival. The journal described Caleb's mother's death when he was 17, killed by an overseer who had tried to force himself on her and whom she had poisoned in self-defense. Caleb had been sold shortly afterward, beginning a series of transactions that would take him from Haiti to Louisiana to Alabama to Mississippi. A progression marked by violence and by Caleb's growing willingness to use his knowledge as a weapon when circumstances became intolerable. I did not want to become what I have become, Caleb wrote in an entry from approximately 1849. I wanted to live quietly, to work, to perhaps earn enough to purchase my freedom someday. But I learned that quietness is interpreted as weakness. That submission invites escalating cruelty. That the only thing that makes a master hesitate is fear. Not obvious fear that would invite immediate retaliation. But subtle fear, the uneasy sense that something is not quite right, that pushing too far might have consequences that cannot be predicted or controlled. I learned to cultivate that subtle fear. I learned to be present without being visible, to watch without being seen, to make small changes that accumulated over time into significant effects. And I learned that when necessary, when a master became too dangerous to be merely feared, he could be eliminated in ways that looked natural and inevitable. And the journal described Rutledge's death in detail, confirming everything that Isaiah and the other witnesses had suspected and that Rutledge's own journal had suggested. Caleb had indeed spent months poisoning his master using plant extracts carefully administered through patients whom he had manipulated with promises that the substances would make Rutledge less cruel. The final confrontation had been planned to the smallest detail time to occur when Rutledge's body was weakened enough that the final substances would cause immediate and catastrophic failure. I knew Rutledge would eventually decide to punish me, Caleb wrote, his type always does. They cannot tolerate the presence of someone they cannot understand or fully control. I made sure his suspicions focused on me at the right time. When my preparations were complete, when his body was ready to collapse, I wanted him to come to me to initiate the confrontation so that what followed would appear to be self-defense or at least provoked by his own actions. And I wanted witnesses so that what I had done would be remembered, so that other enslaved people would know that resistance was possible, even for those who lacked physical strength or opportunities for escape. The journal described Caleb's escape from Mississippi, traveling at night, moving through swamps and forests, eventually making contact with Underground Railroad conductors who helped him reach free territory. He had arrived in Canada in late 1851 and had spent the next several years working odd jobs, learning more, reading everything he could find about medicine and chemistry and biology, transforming himself from someone who used folk knowledge instinctively into someone who understood the scientific principles behind that knowledge. I educated myself, Caleb wrote, not out of love of learning for its own sake, but out of a need to understand what I had done and what I was capable of doing. I needed to know whether I had killed Rutledge through some supernatural power, as some of the other slaves seemed to believe, or through simple application of natural substances that any trained person could use. The answer, I discovered, was the latter. There was nothing supernatural about what I had done. It was chemistry and biology and careful timing. But that knowledge did not comfort me. If anything, it made what I had done more disturbing because it meant I had become what I had always feared becoming. Someone for whom killing was not a desperate last resort, but rather a technical problem to be solved through planning and knowledge. The journal entries from the 1860s described Caleb's service in the Civil War, fighting under an assumed name, using his medical knowledge to save lives on the battlefield, all while struggling with the contradiction of using skills he had developed to kill his oppressor to now save the lives of soldiers fighting to end oppression. He had been wounded twice, both times recovering faster than doctors expected, and he had mustered out in 1865 with an honorable discharge and a small pension. The later entries from the 1870s through the early 1890s described a life of quiet anonymity in Canada, working as an herbalist and occasionally as an informal medical consultant, never advertising his services, but developing a reputation among certain communities as someone who understood illness and healing in ways that conventional doctors did not. He had never married, had formed few close friendships, and had spent much of his time alone, reading, thinking, and trying to come to terms with what he had done and what it had cost him. I survived, Caleb wrote in one of the final entries, dated approximately 1893, when he would have been in his 60s. I lived longer than most enslaved people, longer than most free people, certainly longer than Rutledge or any of the other masters I killed, but I cannot say I truly lived in any meaningful sense. I became a ghost long before I was called that name. I hollowed myself out to survive, removed everything soft and vulnerable, transformed myself into an instrument of resistance and revenge. And when the need for that instrument passed, when slavery ended and the system that created me was destroyed, I found I did not know how to be human again. I had forgotten how to feel joy, how to trust, how to hope for anything except survival. The price of my resistance was my humanity, and I do not know if that was a fair trade or simply the only trade available to me. The journal ended with a reflection that was both chilling and profoundly sad. I am dying now. Slowly but inevitably, my body finally failing after years of abuse and stress. I have no regrets about what I did, but I have no satisfaction either. I killed several men who deserved to die, but their death did not end slavery or heal the damage it caused. I survived when millions did not. But my survival came at a cost that I'm only now beginning to fully understand. If there is a lesson in my story, it is this. Oppression creates monsters on both sides. Rutledge was a monster made by a system that told him he had the right to own human beings. I became a monster made by that same system, shaped by necessity into something that could strike back, but that lost its humanity in the process. The true tragedy is not that either of us died, but that the system that created us both continued for so long, creating so many monsters, destroying so many lives. I pray that future generations will learn from this history, will understand that systems of oppression corrupt everyone they touch, and will choose to build something better. The Historical Society initially debated whether to make Caleb's journal public. The evidence it contained was disturbing and challenged comfortable narratives about slavery and resistance, but ultimately they decided that the truth, however uncomfortable, deserved to be preserved and shared. The journal was published in 1950 with extensive annotations and historical context provided by a team of historians. It caused considerable controversy, with some scholars praising it as an invaluable primary source that provided unique insight into enslaved people's strategies of resistance, while others questioned its authenticity or argued that it presented an overly sympathetic portrait of a murderer. But forensic analysis of the paper and ink confirmed that the journal had indeed been written over a period of decades in the mid to late 19th century. Handwriting analysis matched samples from other documents that could be reliably attributed to the same individual. And most convincingly, the journal contained details about the Rutledge Plantation, about Vicksburg in the 1850s, and about specific events that could only have been known by someone who was actually present. Medical historians who examined the journal were particularly impressed by the level of pharmacological knowledge it demonstrated. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, writing in the Journal of Medical History in 1952, noted that the methodologies described in Caleb's journal align perfectly with what we now understand about the toxic properties of the plants he mentioned. His descriptions of dosages, timing, and combination show sophisticated understanding of pharmacokinetics. How substances are absorbed, distributed, metabolized, and excreted by the human body. This was not folk medicine or superstition. This was applied science carried out by someone with limited formal education, but exceptional observational skills and analytical intelligence. The publication of the journal also prompted several descendants of enslaved people to come forward with family stories that had been passed down through generations. One woman, Marie Dawson, whose great-great-grandmother had been enslaved on a plantation adjacent to the Rutledge property, shared a story that her ancestor had told about the white ghost who made masters afraid. My great-great-grandmother said that after what happened to Mr. Rutledge, the other plantation owners in the area became much more careful, Marie said in an interview recorded in 1951. They stopped the worst beatings. They improved the food a little. They became suspicious of their drinks and their meals. Some of them hired food tasters like kings in old stories, using other slaves to test everything before they ate it themselves. The fear spread beyond just that one plantation. The idea that a slave could kill a master without leaving evidence, could use knowledge as a weapon, could plan months in advance and execute a perfect murder. That idea terrified them. And that fear, my great-great-grandmother said, was worth almost as much as freedom. Not quite, but almost. Because for a little while, they remembered that we were human beings capable of thought and planning and resistance, not just property to be used however they wanted. Other testimonies collected in the 1950s and 1960s suggested that Caleb's story, or at least versions of it, had spread through enslaved communities across the South, becoming a legend that inspired both hope and caution. Hope because it demonstrated that resistance was possible even under the most oppressive conditions. Caution because the story also illustrated the terrible personal cost of such resistance. The way it transformed a person into something cold and calculating, something that could no longer fully participate in normal human community. Forensic investigators in the 1960s, using newly developed techniques, examined the soil samples that had been preserved from the site where Rutledge's body had been found. They confirmed the presence of unusually high concentrations of certain alkaloids and plant compounds that matched the substances Caleb had described using. The concentration was particularly high in the central area where the blood had pooled, and chemical analysis suggested these compounds had indeed come from the plants Caleb had mentioned: poke, white snake root, foxglove, and water hemlock. What we're looking at here is essentially a 19th century poisoning that can now be confirmed using 20th century forensic science, wrote Dr. James Patterson in a 1967 article in Toxicology Today. The methodologies described in Caleb's journal are scientifically sound. The substances he used would indeed have produced the effects he described. The timeline he outlined, months of gradual poisoning followed by a final catastrophic dose, aligns perfectly with what we understand about cumulative toxicity and cardiovascular collapse. This was not luck or coincidence. This was deliberate, knowledgeable, and expertly executed. The last confirmed reference to Caleb appeared in Canadian census records from 1891, where a man matching his description described as albino Negro, age approximately 64, occupation herbalist, unmarried, no children, was listed as living alone in a rural area outside Toronto. The 1901 census showed no such person at that address or anywhere in the surrounding region, suggesting that Caleb had died sometime in the 1890s, as his journal indicated. Several researchers attempted to locate his grave, but found no burial records under the name Caleb or under any of the various aliases that he was known to have used. He had apparently died as he had lived for most of his adult life, anonymously, leaving minimal trace, existing at the margins of official record-keeping. The only permanent record of his existence was his journal, the testimony of those who had known him, and the carefully documented death of Nathaniel Rutledge on September 15, 1851. In 1998, the Warren County Historical Society erected a small marker near the site where the Rutledge plantation had once stood. The marker does not mention Caleb by name or describe the specific circumstances of Rutledge's death, but it acknowledges the complexity of the historical record. On this land stood the Rutledge Plantation, site of one of the most controversial incidents in Warren County history. In September 1851, plantation owner Nathaniel Rutledge died under circumstances that remain disputed. Official records attributed his death to natural causes. Other accounts suggest he was killed by an enslaved person using sophisticated knowledge of plant toxins. Whatever the truth, this incident serves as a reminder that the history of slavery is not simple. That resistance took many forms and that enslaved people possessed intelligence, knowledge, and agency that the system of slavery attempted but failed to completely suppress. We remember all who lived and died here, both the oppressor and the oppressed, as we work to ensure that such systems of human exploitation are never permitted to exist again. The marker sparked protests from some local residents who felt it was inappropriate to commemorate what they considered a murder, while others praised it for acknowledging historical complexity. The debate continued in local newspapers for months, with historians, civil rights activists, and descendants of both enslaved people and slave owners offering competing interpretations of what the incident meant and how it should be remembered. But perhaps the most telling commentary came from Dr. Angela Freeman, an African-American historian who had studied Caleb's case extensively. In a 2003 article titled The Ethics of Resistance, Reconsidering Violence in the Context of Slavery, she wrote, "We are uncomfortable with Caleb because his story forces us to confront questions we would prefer to avoid. Was he justified in killing Rutledge? By modern legal standards, no. He committed premeditated murder. But can modern